Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku's reality was just a simulation. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was a symphony of controlled chaos, and Izuku Midoriya was its conductor. Concrete dust, thick and chalky, hazed the air of this cityscape training ground, known affectionately to the students of UA as Ground Beta. To his left, a glacier erupted from the street, courtesy of Todoroki, encasing a trio of villain bots in an instant tomb of ice. To his right, Bakugo was a screaming comet of orange and white, his explosions punctuating the air with concussive booms that rattled the fillings in Izuku's teeth. The familiar, comforting scent of burnt sugar and ozone hung heavy in the air. It was the smell of progress. Uraraka, report. Status on the Eastern Sector civilian evac? Ida's voice, crisp and authoritative, crackled through their comms. All clear, Ida-kun. Floating the last dummy to the triage point now. Izuku didn't need the comms. He could feel it all, see it all. One for all, full cowling at 25% was no longer a strain. It was a second skin. Emerald lightning danced over his limbs, a visible manifestation of the borrowed power thrumming through his veins. His mind, always a whirlwind of analysis and strategy, was preternaturally calm. He saw the battlefield not as a mess of streets and buildings, but as a three-dimensional grid of possibilities, threats, and solutions. Bakugo's trajectory is pushing the remaining bots southwest, he analyzed, his feet barely touching the asphalt as he blitzed down an alley. Todoroki is locking down the northern perimeter. That leaves a pocket of 3 bots unaccounted for near the central plaza. Their programming dictates they'll target the highest concentration of civilians, the dummies at the triage point. He was already moving, his body responding to a conclusion his mind had reached milliseconds prior. He ricocheted off a brick wall, the impact barely registering, using the momentum to launch himself over a rooftop. The wind whistled past his ears, a familiar song of flight. Below him, the plaza came into view. Just as he predicted, 3 sleek, chrome bots were lumbering toward the designated safe zone, their optical sensors glowing a menacing red. Too slow. He angled his descent, tucking his legs. Manchester, he whispered, the name of the move a comforting prayer. The energy of One for All pulled in his leg, the lightning around his boot intensifying. He was a green meteor poised to deliver salvation. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a villain, or a collapsing building. It was a bird. A simple, brown sparrow, soaring against the flawlessly blue, artificial sky of the training facility. It was just another detail in the rich tapestry of the simulation, meant to add a touch of realism. Except it stopped. For one single, solitary, impossible second, the sparrow froze mid-flight. Its wings were locked in the apex of an upward stroke, a perfect, unmoving sculpture against the cerulean backdrop. The world continued around it. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, Bakugo's distant explosions still echoed, and Izuku himself was still hurtling towards the ground. But the bird was a pin in the fabric of reality, holding it fast. Then, just as strangely as it stopped, it jittered. Like a frame of film skipping in a projector, it jerked forward a few inches, then back, then forward again, before its wings completed their stroke, and it resumed its graceful flight as if nothing had ever happened. The entire event lasted no more than a second and a half. Izuku's focus, for the first time in months, shattered. His mind snagged on the impossibility. What was that? His landing was sloppy. Instead of the clean, silent impact he'd intended, his feet hit the ground with a jarring thud. The Manchester smash he'd been preparing dissipated, the energy fizzling out. The 3 bots, alerted to his presence, swiveled in unison, their weaponized arms whirring to life. Damn it! He hissed, shaking his head. He had to refocus. There were bots to smash, a drill to complete. He blamed exhaustion. He'd been up late the night before, analyzing footage of Mirko's fighting style. His eyes were probably just playing tricks on him. A momentary lapse. A brain fart. Nothing more. He dodged a volley of rubber bullets, the analytical calm returning, albeit with a new, frustrating flaw. A tiny part of his brain was still stuck on the image of that frozen bird. He dispatched the bots with a flurry of precise Delaware smashes, flicks of air pressure that sent them tumbling into a heap of scrap metal. The exercise was a success. All bots neutralized. Hero team wins. All Might's booming, pre-recorded voice echoed from the facility's speakers. A wave of relief and exhaustion washed over Class 1A. Bakugo landed nearby, scowling. Took you long enough, damn Deku! I could have finished those 3 myself in half the time. Great work, Midoriya-kun. Ida Power walked over, his hand chopping the air with enthusiasm. Your reaction time was exemplary, though your final landing was 0.3 seconds slower than your average. A minor point for improvement. He's just tired, Uraraka said, jogging up to them, her cheeks flushed. You've been pushing yourself really hard, Deku-kun. That was amazing, Izuku forced a smile. Thanks, guys. I just got a little distracted. He glanced up at the sky, but the sparrow was long gone. It was just a vast, perfect, unblemished blue. A trick of the light. It had to be. The feeling of wrongness, however, did not dissipate with the adrenaline. It clung to him like a film of grime. He tried to wash it away in the showers, to ignore it during the post-exercise debriefing with Mr. Aizawa, but it was a persistent, low-frequency hum in the back of his mind. During the debrief, he found his attention drifting from Aizawa's tired, logical breakdown of their performance. His gaze wandered to the city outside the classroom window. It was a bustling, vibrant metropolis, the heart of Japan. People moved on the sidewalks below, cars flowed through the streets in an intricate, unending dance. He focused on one man in a mustard-colored trench coat carrying a briefcase. The man walked from the edge of a crosswalk to the door of a coffee shop, paused, checked his watch, and then turned around and walked back to the crosswalk. Izuku watched him, intrigued. The man waited for the light to change, crossed the street, and walked down the block until he was out of sight. A few minutes later, Izuku's eyes were drawn back to the same crosswalk. The same man in the same mustard-colored coat appeared, briefcase in hand. He walked to the coffee shop door, paused, checked his watch with the exact same motion, and then walked back. Coincidence? A weird one, but not impossible. Maybe he was waiting for someone, but then it happened a third time. And a fourth. The same path, the same pause, the same turn, the same check of the watch. It was a loop. A perfect, unbroken, 4-minute loop of behavior. His analytical mind, the very tool that let him deconstruct quirks and battle strategies, began to race. The odds of a person repeating such a specific set of actions with that level of temporal precision were infinitesimally small. It wasn't human. It was programmatic. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He felt a sudden, desperate need for Mr. Aizawa's voice to ground him. He focused on his teacher, who was now pointing a remote at the large monitor. Midoriya. Aizawa's voice was its usual monotone drawl. Your initial assessment of the enemy placement was flawless. But your engagement was sloppy. Report. Izuku flinched, caught off guard. Ah, yes, sensei. I misjudged my descent velocity. I was momentarily disoriented. It was a lie, but what could he say? I saw a bird break the laws of physics, and now I think that man in the coat is a computer program? Aizawa's eyes narrowed, but he seemed to accept the explanation. He clicked the remote, and the footage rewound slightly. Watch again. The key to a successful blitz is maintaining focus from inception to conclusion. A single lapse can be fatal in a real-world scenario. You must, and then it happened again. The sound glitched. For a fraction of a second, Aizawa's voice became tinny, metallic. The words, "You must," repeated 3 times in rapid succession, like a scratched CD, accompanied by an audible crackle of digital artifacting. Must, be better than that. The sound corrected itself just as quickly, and Aizawa finished his sentence, as if nothing had happened. Izuku's blood ran cold. He shot a glance around the room. Kirishima was nodding seriously. Yaoyorozu was taking meticulous notes. Kaminari was trying his best to look attentive. No one else had reacted. Not a single flicker of confusion. Not a single questioning glance. It was as if they hadn't heard it. But it had been so obvious, so jarring. It was like a shout in a silent library. Did you guys hear that? Izuku whispered to Ida, who was seated next to him. Ida adjusted his glasses, not taking his eyes off the screen. Hear what, Midoriya-kun? Mr. Aizawa's critique? I heard it loud and clear. We must all strive for constant improvement. No, his voice, it sounded weird. It kind of skipped. Ida finally turned to him, his expression one of genuine concern. Skipped? Perhaps there was a momentary feedback issue with your personal comms unit? They are still active, though on standby. You should have it checked by the support department. Izuku's comm unit was on his ear. But the sound hadn't come from the comm, it had come from Aizawa, from the front of the room. It had been ambient real. He opened his mouth to argue, but then closed it. What was the point? Ida had a logical explanation. It was always a logical explanation. He was tired. The comms were faulty. He was stressed. His mind was playing tricks on him, but his mind was the one thing he had always been able to trust. He felt a new sensation, something he hadn't felt since he was a small, quirkless child being told his dreams were impossible. He felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. That evening, he tried to push the strangeness of the day aside. He joined his friends for dinner in the common area of the Alliance Heights dorms. The room was alive with the easy chatter and laughter of teenagers who had faced death together and come out stronger. Sato was showing off a new cake recipe, Jiro was arguing with Kaminari about music, and Bakugo was, as usual, yelling at someone, this time Kirishima, for reaching over his plate. It was normal. It was home, but Izuku felt like he was watching it all through a pane of thick glass. Every laugh seemed a little too loud, every gesture a little too broad. He kept looking for the seams, the little tears in the fabric of their reality. Was Sato's cake recipe from a database? Was Bakugo's rage just a predetermined character trait set to maximum? The thoughts were poison, and he knew it. These were his friends. He loved them. He would die for them. But the analytical part of his brain, now infected with this terrifying new variable, couldn't stop. Hypothesis. I am experiencing some form of psychological break. Stress-induced auditory and visual hallucinations. Evidence for extreme physical and mental exertion. High-stakes lifestyle. Evidence against the nature of the hallucinations. They are not random. They are specific, technical failures. A frozen bird isn't a monster from a nightmare. It's a graphical rendering error. A looped voice isn't a demon whispering. It's a corrupted audio file. The looping man isn't a ghost. He's an NPC. The acronym, NPC, non-player character, sprang into his mind from the countless hours he'd spent playing old video games as a kid. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach. Deku-kun? You okay? You've been staring at your katsudon for 5 minutes. He looked up into Uraraka's wide, concerned brown eyes. Ida was looking at him too, his brow furrowed. Oh. Yeah, sorry. Just thinking, he mumbled, finally taking a bite. The flavor was perfect, exactly as he remembered it. But a new, terrifying question lodged itself in his throat. Is this real? Or is it just data representing the flavor of katsudon? He needed to test it. A small, controlled experiment. Hey guys, he began, trying to sound casual. The weirdest thing happened during the training exercise today. I saw a bird just freeze in the sky for a second. Did either of you see anything like that? He watched their faces, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. A shared experience would disprove the delusion. Uraraka tilted her head. A bird? No, I don't think so. I was pretty focused on the evac dummies. You're probably just super tired, Deku-kun. Your eyes can play tricks on you when you're exhausted. She gave him a comforting smile, the kind that usually made his anxieties melt away. This time, it only made the cold knot in his stomach tighten. Indeed! Ida chimed in, ever the rationalist. Rapid eye movement combined with high-velocity traversal can create momentary optical illusions, such as perceived motion cessation in distant objects. It's a documented phenomenon. You must ensure you are getting at least 8 hours of sleep to maintain peak cognitive and physical function. They were so earnest. So kind. And so utterly dismissive. Their logic was sound, their reasoning perfect. They were offering the exact explanations he had first offered himself. But he knew, with a certainty that was starting to eclipse his own self-doubt, that they were wrong. He hadn't seen an illusion. He had seen a glitch in the matrix. He excused himself early, claiming he needed to study. The looks of concern from his friends followed him to the elevator. The feeling of isolation was no longer a hum, it was a roar. Back in his room, surrounded by the ever-watchful, smiling faces of All Might from posters and figurines, he felt a crushing sense of despair. This was his sanctuary, a shrine to the dream he had fought so hard to make real. The dream All Might himself had bestowed upon him. He paced the floor, his mind a frantic storm. The bird. The looping man. The voice. What was the common denominator? He had been a passive observer for the first two. But the voice glitch, had that been random? Or had it happened because Aizawa was talking to him? And then another memory surfaced, one he had suppressed out of sheer frustration. It had been happening for weeks, but he dismissed it as tinnitus or a side effect of his quirk. Sometimes, when he pushed full calling hard, not just to 25%, but when he flirted with 30% or 40% in short, desperate bursts, he would hear it. A faint, high-pitched, electronic squeal, like the whine of an ancient CRT monitor powering on. It was a sound that seemed to exist just at the edge of his hearing, a piercing needle of static that pricked at the inside of his skull. He had assumed it was just the sound of so much power coursing through his body, a neurological side effect. Now, he wasn't so sure. He had to know. He had to be sure. It was one thing to see and hear strange things. It was another to be able to replicate them. His body trembling, he stood in the center of his room. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of his heart. One for all, he whispered. The familiar warmth spread through him. Full calling. 25%. The emerald lightning flickered to life, bathing his room in a green glow. The familiar power surged, a river of strength. He felt normal. Stable. He listened, straining his ears. Nothing but the low hum of the dorm's ventilation system. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. 30%. The lightning intensified. The air in the room crackled. The All Might figurines on his shelves vibrated slightly. He felt the familiar strain, the protest of muscles and sinews not yet ready for this level of output. And he heard it. Eeeeee. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A high-frequency whine, right at the top of his auditory range. It wasn't in the room, it was in his head. It was the sound of a machine being pushed beyond its designated parameters. It was the sound of a processor overheating. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. Fear, cold and sharp, sank its teeth into him. 35%. He choked out. The whine grew louder, more insistent. A strange pressure began to build behind his eyes. The green light of his quirk seemed to flicker, to waver, not like lightning, but like a faulty fluorescent bulb. He could feel the damage starting, the telltale ache in his bones that warned of overexertion. But he had to push it. He had to see. 40%. The whine became a piercing shriek in his mind. The posters on his wall seemed to momentarily lose their color saturation, fading to a dull gray for a split second. The pressure behind his eyes was immense. He felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just physical strain. This was something else. This was system strain. He dropped the quirk, collapsing to his knees, gasping for breath. The whine vanished instantly. The world snapped back into sharp, stable focus. He was just Azuka Midoriya, a boy in his room, panting on the floor. But he knew. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. He had a repeatable result. Pushing his power to its limits caused reality itself to degrade. His quirk, his sacred gift from All Might, the very core of his being, was somehow connected to the glitches. He was the variable. He was the one breaking the world. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady, and lurched toward his window, desperate for a glimpse of the real, solid, unshakable world outside. He needed to see something normal. A car driving by, a distant light. Anything. His dorm room faced away from the main city, offering a view of the expansive grounds and the sky above. The night was clear, the stars bright. A few lazy, Puffy clouds drifted by, illuminated by the moon. He stared at them, his breath catching in his throat. They were wrong. They weren't the random, chaotic, beautiful formations of water vapor he knew them to be. One cloud in particular, a massive, sprawling shape, was impossibly detailed. It was a pattern of swirls and eddies, spiraling into smaller and smaller versions of itself. It was intricate, mathematical, and perfectly, flawlessly symmetrical. It was a Mandelbrot set rendered in incandescent vapor, a piece of complex generative art hanging in the night sky where a simple cloud should be. It was the most beautiful and most terrifying thing he had ever seen. He stared, mesmerized and horrified, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. It was a final, undeniable proof. Nature did not create such perfect, complex, repeating geometry on this scale. Only a computer could. Only an algorithm, following a precise set of rules, could render such a thing. As he stared, his mind finally breaking free from the prison of rationalization, the final glitch occurred. It was not in the world outside. It was not a sound, or a sight, or a feeling. It was in his vision. For a single, blinding nanosecond, a line of crisp, green, monospace text flashed across his field of view, superimposed over the impossible cloud. It was sharp and clear, like a line of code in a programmer's interface. // weather _array _04 static // and then it was gone. Izuku stumbled backward, his heel catching on an All Might figurine. He crashed to the floor, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His heart wasn't just pounding anymore. It was trying to batter its way out of his chest. Cold sweat drenched his shirt. The room spun around him, the smiling face of the symbol of peace on his wall mocking him with its simple, unwavering optimism. The bird was a rendering lag. The man in the coat was a looping NPC. Aizawa's voice was a corrupted audio file. The static was a processor overload. The cloud was a faulty asset, and the line of code was the signature of the artist. His world was not real. His life, his friends, his school, his quirk, it was all a program. A simulation. And he, somehow, was beginning to see the code. The terror of that realization was absolute. It was a depth of fear beyond villains, beyond death, beyond failure. It was the fear of discovering that your very soul is a lie. He curled into a ball on the floor of his bedroom, shaking uncontrollably, a silent scream trapped in his throat. The hero's journey, the sweat, the tears, the blood, it was all just a story being told by a machine. And the story was starting to fall apart. Sleep offered no escape. It was a treacherous landscape of its own, populated by looping nightmares. He dreamed of the man in the mustard coat, walking an endless sidewalk in a void of white. He dreamed of sparrows made of stone, hanging motionless in a blood-red sky. He dreamed of All Might's smiling face, but when he looked closer, the hero's eyes were blank, glassy orbs, and his booming laugh was a corrupted audio file, skipping and stuttering into a cacophony of digital noise. Izuku awoke with a jolt, his sheets soaked in a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The pre-dawn light was filtering through his window, casting long, eerie shadows. For a moment, he was just a tired student in his dorm. Then the memory of the code, / weather _array _04 static / flashed behind his eyes, and the crushing weight of his new reality settled over him again. The room, his sanctuary, had become a cell. The posters of All Might were no longer inspirations. They were the face of his jailer, the lead character in the fiction that was his life. He looked at his own hands, turning them over. The familiar scars on his fingers from years of reckless smashes, the calluses from his relentless training, were they real? Or were they just part of his character model, textured onto his digital skin to sell the illusion of a struggle? A wave of nausea washed over him. He stumbled to the bathroom, retching into the toilet, but only sour bow came up. He felt hollowed out, a ghost haunting a body that wasn't his, in a world that wasn't real. He stayed there for a long time, head resting against the cool porcelain, the world a dizzying mess. Panic was a tidal wave threatening to pull him under. He could drown in it. He could let the madness take him, accept that he was broken, and wait for the men in white coats, or whatever this world's equivalent was, to take him away. But then, another instinct, one forged in the fires of 100 battles, real or not, kicked in. It was the part of him that saw a problem and refused to surrender. It was the analyst. He pushed himself up, his reflection a pale, haunted stranger in the mirror. His eyes, usually bright with determination, were wide with terror, but deep within them, a tiny, familiar spark was kindling. The part of him that filled notebook after notebook with observations, theories, and strategies. His fear was a villain of incomprehensible power. And how did he fight villains? He analyzed them. He found their weaknesses. He understood them. He strode to his desk, sweeping aside his hero analysis notebooks. They were artifacts of a dead past, studies of a fantasy. He dug through his bag and pulled out a fresh one, its crisp, blank pages a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. He uncapped a pen, the click unnaturally loud in the silent room. For a moment, he hovered over the first page, his hand trembling. Then, he began to write. He didn't title it Hero Analysis for the Future. That future was a lie. Instead, with a grim sense of purpose, he wrote a new title across the top of the page, the letters sharp and angry. Analysis for a future I don't understand. His first entries were frantic, the ink bleeding slightly from the pressure of his pen. Observation 1. Avian motion cessation. Sparrow in ground beta. Froze mid-flight for 1.5 s. Followed by jitter/frame skip. Asset rendering error? Physics engine lag? Observation 2. Behavioral loop. Male, trench coat, briefcase. 4-minute loop, precise repetition. Not human behavior. NPC script. Observation 3. Auditory corruption. Aizawa-sensei's voice. Looping artifact must. Isolated to me? Or is my perception the only one that registers the error? Observation 4. System strain manifestation. High-pitched frequency noise correlated with OFA output 30%. Visual degradation color saturation loss at 40%. My quirk is a tax on the system's processing power. Observation 5. Impossible geometry. Symmetrical cloud formation. Fractal pattern. Not naturally occurring. Faulty procedural generation? Observation 6. Direct system feedback. Line of code / weather _array _04 static / visible in FOV. A debug message? An error log? This is the smoking gun. This is undeniable. He stared at the list. It was no longer a collection of strange, isolated incidents. It was data. A pattern. A thread he could pull to unravel everything. The fear was still there, a cold ocean in his gut, but now it had a shoreline. The analyst was awake. He was no longer just a victim of the glitches, he was going to be their investigator. His new hypothesis was simple and terrifying. His reality was a complex, interactive simulation, and he, Izuku Midoriya, was for some reason becoming aware of its nature. He needed more data. He needed to conduct tests. He needed to push the boundaries, not with his fists, but with his mind. His first experiment was one of passive observation, born of a memory of Ida's rigid punctuality. The school bell. He synchronized his phone's digital clock with the official time server down to the millisecond. The first bell of the day was scheduled for 8 hours and 25 minutes. He stood in the hallway, phone in hand, heart ticking along with the seconds. 8 hours 24 minutes and 58 seconds. 8 hours 24 minutes and 59 seconds. 8 hours and 25 minutes. The chime that echoed through the halls was a pleasant, melodic tone. But Izuku wasn't listening to the melody. He was watching his phone. The very instant the display ticked over to 8 hours 25 minutes seconds, the first note of the bell began. Not a fraction of a second before, not a fraction of a second after. It was perfect. Too perfect. A real-world automated system, even a good one, would have minuscule deviations. A network lag of a few milliseconds, a slight drift in the master clock. But this was absolute. He tested it again at the end of the period. And again at lunch. Each time, he moved to a different part of the sprawling UA campus. In the cafeteria, in the gym, near the support course workshops. The sound should have reached him at slightly different times based on his distance from the nearest speaker, a subtle Doppler effect as he moved. There was none. The sound simply was, appearing in his perception at the exact same instant, with the exact same volume and clarity, regardless of his location. It wasn't a sound propagating through space. It was an audio file being played directly into the simulation's soundscape. He discreetly noted it in his new notebook, tucked inside his textbook during class. Test 1, Temporal Precision. Result, confirmed. Bell's schedule is absolute, synchronized to the millisecond with no environmental delay. Conclusion: the bell is a triggered system event, not a physical phenomenon. The cold certainty grew. His next test was more active. The simulation was vast, but how deep did it go? A game world often had incredibly detailed foregrounds, but the backgrounds were frequently shallow, just enough to maintain the illusion. He needed to find the simulation's background. During his free period, he went to the UA library. It was a magnificent place, 2 stories of towering shelves filled with what appeared to be centuries of knowledge. It was quiet, smelling of old paper and lemon polish. He found the history section, his fingers tracing the spines of thick, leather-bound tomes. His target, deep pre-quirk history. The outline in his head was clear. Pick something complex, messy, and filled with conflicting human accounts. He pulled a heavy volume titled The English Civil War, a comprehensive history. He found a secluded corral and opened it. The text was printed in a clean, academic font. It described the conflict between the parliamentarians and the royalists, listed the major battles, and gave brief biographies of Oliver Cromwell and King Charles I. It was all factually correct, and it was all utterly lifeless. It read like a well-written but soulless encyclopedia entry. It gave the what, but not the why. There were no excerpts from primary sources, no frantic letters from soldiers, no passionate diary entries from concerned citizens, no transcripts of the fiery, complex parliamentary debates. History, as Izuku knew from his own obsessive studies, was a messy, human tapestry woven from millions of individual perspectives and biases. This book presented it as a neat, clean, settled affair. All the battles were listed with precise casualty numbers, a feat impossible even for modern historians. There were no conflicting accounts, no academic arguments, no sense of the raw, chaotic emotion that fueled a nation to tear itself apart. He pulled another book, this one on the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. Same result. A perfect summary of events, dates, and key figures. It mentioned the strict social hierarchy, but it didn't convey the crushing weight of it. It mentioned the flourishing of arts like ukiyo-e and kabuki, but it offered no deep cultural analysis, no sense of the soul of the people. It was placeholder text. A backdrop painted to look like a library. The information was only as deep as it needed to be to fool a casual observer. But he was not a casual observer. He was an analyst. He closed the book, the soft thud echoing in the silent library. He looked up and met the eyes of the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a neat bun. On a whim, he decided to test her. He walked to her desk. "Excuse me, ma'am?" he said, his voice quiet. "Yes, young man? Can I help you find something?" Her smile was warm and placid. "I was reading about the English Civil War, and I was wondering if you had any collections of primary source documents from the period. Specifically, I'm looking for accounts from the Levelers or the Diggers, the more radical factions. I'm interested in the philosophical schisms within the parliamentarian movement." It was an obscure, deeply specific question. A real historian or a passionate librarian might have lit up, eager for a deep discussion. The woman's smile didn't waver. Her eyes, however, seemed to go momentarily blank, as if searching a database for a response. After a second's pause, she gave a polite, gentle, and completely unhelpful answer. "I'm sure whatever you need is in the designated section, dear. Just keep looking. History is a very large subject." It was a dialogue dead end. A polite dismissal from an NPC whose conversation tree he had just exhausted. He thanked her and walked away, the cold knot in his stomach now a block of ice. Test 2, Data Depth. Result, confirmed. Historical information is shallow, lacking primary sources, complexity, and human nuance. NPC interaction is scripted and lacks dynamic response. Conclusion: the world's lore is only skin deep. The weekend arrived. He needed to get off campus. He needed to test the wider world, the city itself. He told his friends he needed to buy new compression sleeves for his arms, a plausible excuse that earned him worried clucks from Uraraka and a stern lecture on proper equipment maintenance from Ida. Their concern was a knife in his heart. Every interaction was now tainted with a horrifying question: is this real? Is her worry a genuine emotion, or an emergent AI subroutine? Is his lecture a personality trait, or a set of programmed responses? He had to force himself to smile, to nod, to promise he'd be careful. The deception was exhausting. He took the train into the city, the journey itself a new source of torment. Were the other passengers real people with lives, hopes, and dreams? Or were they just set dressing, a collection of character models designed to make the train feel full? He watched a mother scold her child, a pair of businessmen talking on their phones, a teenager listening to music. It all looked so real. But so did the rest of it. He found a bench in a busy plaza, a perfect vantage point. He didn't go to a store. He just sat, and he watched. He was a hunter now, and the prey was the flaws in his reality. It didn't take long to find them. He saw it everywhere. The man in the mustard coat wasn't an anomaly. He was the rule. Izuku tracked a dozen different civilians. A woman with a red umbrella would walk to a corner, open a newspaper, read the same page for exactly 90 seconds, then fold it and walk away, only to reappear from the opposite direction 15 minutes later to repeat the cycle. A pair of teens would have an animated, but silent, conversation near a fountain, gesturing wildly, before walking off, their paths resetting them to their starting point to have the same silent conversation again. He saw the grocery bag scene he'd witnessed from his classroom window. A woman, this time with blonde hair, dropped a bag of oranges. A man in a tracksuit jogged over to help her. They exchanged a few pleasantries, he handed her the last orange, and they went their separate ways. It was a charming little slice of life. 20 minutes later he saw it again. Different character models, a bag of apples this time, but the animations, the timing, the sequence of events, it was identical. It was a scripted ambient event, designed to make the world feel alive, but its repetition betrayed its artificiality. He had to try something. He stood up and walked into the path of a man who was on a simple looping trajectory from a lamppost to a newsstand. The man stopped a foot away from him, his face impassive. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice utterly neutral. There was no flicker of impatience, no annoyance at being blocked. He simply paused, as if his pathfinding algorithm was recalculating. After a 2-second delay, he sidestepped Izuku with an unnatural smoothness, and seamlessly resumed his walk toward the newsstand as if Izuku had never been there. Izuku felt a profound, chilling emptiness. He hadn't interacted with a person. He had been an obstacle for a program. These weren't people. They were puppets, dancing on invisible strings, and he was the only one in the audience who could see them. The final test was the one he dreaded most. It was the one that couldn't be explained away by faulty programming or shallow data. It was a test of the soul of his world. It was the All Might test. All Might, the man who had given him everything. The man whose belief had single-handedly rewritten his destiny. If he was a lie, then everything was a lie. Izuku's entire existence was built on the foundation of one moment. A scrawny, quirkless boy on a rooftop asking a hero if he could still save people. He found Toshinori Yagi in one of the smaller, private training rooms after school. The hero was in his skeletal form, wiping down some equipment with a rag. He looked tired, but he offered Izuku a small, genuine-seeming smile when he saw him. "Ah, young Midoriya. Putting in extra hours? That's the spirit!" Izuku's mouth was dry. His palms were sweating. "All Might, can I ask you something?" "Something personal?" Toshinori's smile softened. He leaned against a pommel horse, his posture relaxed. "Of course, my boy. What's on your mind?" This was it. Izuku had rehearsed the question 100 times in his head. It couldn't be about facts or events. It had to be about a feeling, a complex, negative, deeply human feeling that a simple program would struggle to replicate authentically. He took a shaky breath. "When you were in America, before you came back to Japan, before you were the undisputed #1, the symbol of peace, there must have been a time you felt completely and utterly alone. Not just lonely, but isolated, like the weight of the whole world was on your shoulders. But there wasn't a single person you could truly talk to about the fear that you might not be strong enough, that you might fail. I'm not talking about fighting villains. I'm talking about that specific, quiet feeling of crushing isolation. How did you deal with that feeling? He watched Tashinori's face, searching for a flicker of memory, of pain, of genuine empathy. He saw the hero's brow furrow in thought. He saw him look away for a moment, as if accessing a difficult memory. The performance was flawless. Then, Tashinori looked back at him, and the iconic, charismatic All Might smile bloomed on his face, though it seemed too big for his gaunt features. I see what you're getting at, my boy, he said, his voice resonating with practiced warmth. But you see, a true hero never gives in to despair. That feeling, that doubt, it's just another villain to be defeated. Whenever I felt that pressure, I just smiled. I smiled to reassure others, and I smiled to reassure myself. You have to stand tall, puff out your chest, and show the world that everything is fine. Because that is what a hero does. He clapped Izuku on the shoulder, a familiar, encouraging gesture. But Izuku barely felt it. The words were perfect. They were exactly what All Might would say at a press conference. It was a beautiful, inspiring, pre-canned motivational speech, and it completely, utterly failed to answer the question. He hadn't asked how a hero should act. He had asked how a man, Tashinori Yagi, had felt. He had asked about the quiet moments of despair, and All Might had given him a public service announcement. There was no personal anecdote, no confession of weakness, no shared vulnerability. It was a deflection. A perfectly crafted, in-character deflection. Izuku looked into his mentor's eyes, those bright blue eyes that had been his guiding stars. And for the first time, he saw the truth. The warmth was a rendering. The twinkle was an emission map. It was a beautifully simulated kindness, but it didn't reach the core. Behind the brilliant blue, there was nothing. A void. This was the blow that finally shattered him. The looping man was disturbing. The shallow library was unnerving. But this was an agony beyond words. The man who had saved his soul was a ghost in the machine. A beautiful, intricate puppet designed to play a part in his story. Tears welled in Izuku's eyes. He couldn't hide them. Thank you, All Might, he whispered, his voice cracking. That helps. He turned and fled before Tashinori's programmed concern could trigger, before he could offer another hollow platitude. He ran through the empty halls of UA, the school he loved, which now felt like a digital prison. He didn't stop until he was back in his room, the door locked behind him, his back pressed against it as he slid to the floor, silent sobs racking his body. It was all true. His terrified hypothesis was now a confirmed theory. His friends were advanced AIs. His teachers were scripted mentors. His idol was a collection of heroic subroutines. His entire world was a stage, and they were all actors. And he was the lead, the protagonist. The cornerstone, as the project name from the outline implied. He lay on his floor for hours as darkness fell, staring at the ceiling. The grief was a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. But as the hours passed, the grief began to cool, hardening into something else. A cold, hard, terrifying resolve. He sat up and pulled his new notebook onto his lap. He flipped to a fresh page. The data was collected. The conclusion was reached. Now came the final step of any analysis, the action plan. His mind raced, connecting the dots with a desperate clarity. The glitches? They happened when the system was under strain. When he pushed his quirk. When he did something unexpected, like stare at a background character too long or ask a question that wasn't in the script. The simulation was stable as long as he followed the path laid out for him, the hero's journey. It reacted and buckled when he deviated. The thought was terrifying, but it was also empowering. If the system was built around him, if he was the central processing unit of this entire narrative, then he had the power to crash it. He couldn't keep living in this beautiful, elaborate lie. He couldn't treat the emergent, feeling programs he called friends as puppets. He couldn't accept a world where his greatest triumphs were just lines of code being executed. He needed the truth, no matter how ugly. If he was in a cage, he wasn't going to just pace in it, he was going to break the bars. He needed to do something so unexpected, so narrative-breaking, so completely off-script that the system wouldn't be able to handle it. He couldn't just punch a wall. It had to be something symbolic. It had to be a total rejection of his story. His eyes drifted to the window, and he looked out into the night. In the distance, he could see the faint silhouette of the skyline of the city, and among the rooftops he knew was a specific one. A rooftop where a quirkless boy had his dreams shattered and then rebuilt in the span of 10 minutes. The place where Toshinori Yagi had said, "You can become a hero," the genesis. The inciting incident. The cornerstone of the simulation called Izuku Midoriya. A desperate, dangerous, audacious plan bloomed in his mind. It was a plan born of grief and analytical fury. It might destroy him. It might destroy this entire world, and the thinking, feeling beings within it. It was the most reckless thing he had ever considered, far beyond any self-destructive smash. But it was the only way to get answers. It was the only way to find out what was real. He stood up, his face set in a mask of grim determination that no one at UA had ever seen on him before. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window, a boy about to declare war on his own reality. It was time to break the narrative. The night passed in a state of hyper-aware limbo. Izuku did not sleep. He lay on his bed, fully clothed, listening to the simulated sounds of his world. The gentle hum of the dormitory's air conditioning, the distant, algorithmically generated chirp of a cricket outside his window, the muffled footfalls of Ida making a final patrol of the hallways. Each sound was a note in a grand, artificial symphony, and he was the only one who had read the composer's score. He was terrifyingly calm. The maelstrom of grief and panic from the day before had cooled into a single, dense point of purpose in the center of his chest. It was the same cold focus he felt in the split seconds before a battle, when all possibilities narrowed to a single, decisive action. This time, the battle was not against a villain of flesh and blood, but against the very laws of his existence. When his alarm chimed, precisely at 6 hours, he silenced it before the first note could finish. He went through the motions of his morning with the detached precision of a machine. He showered, the sensation of the water, its temperature, its pressure, feeling like a phantom limb. He dressed in his school uniform, the familiar fabric a costume for a role he was about to abandon. As he was about to leave his room, his eyes fell upon his desk. On it, nestled between a stack of textbooks, was his notebook. Analysis for a future I don't understand. It was the only real thing he had produced in this world. He couldn't just leave. He couldn't let his friends, the emergent, feeling programs he still loved with every fiber of his being, wake up to find him gone without a word. If there was even a sliver of a chance that they were more than code, that their consciousness could survive whatever he was about to do, they deserved an explanation. He tore a fresh sheet from the back. His hand, usually so steady when analyzing, trembled as he began to write. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a hypothesis. It was a prayer. To my friends, to anyone who finds this, I don't know how to explain this in a way that will make sense. I hope it doesn't have to. I hope that by the time you read this, my actions were meaningless, and I was just wrong. I would give anything to be wrong, but I don't think I am. Our world is not what we think it is. There are cracks in it. Glitches. Errors in the code. I have been documenting them. Things that are physically, mathematically impossible. I believe we are living inside a simulation of some kind. A program. An impossibly advanced one, but a program nonetheless. I know how that sounds. But I have seen it. I have tested it. My quirk, one for all, seems to place a strain on the system. It causes errors. It makes the world flicker. I cannot live in a lie, no matter how beautiful. And I cannot treat you, Uraraka, Ida, Todoroki, Kaken, all of you, as if you aren't real. My heart tells me you are. Even if you were born from code, the kindness, the courage, the bonds we have forged, they feel real. They are the realest things I have ever known. That is why I have to do this. I am going to the place where my story began. I am going to try to break the narrative. To force a system crash. I don't know what will happen. It might delete me. It might delete everything. Or maybe it will show us what's on the other side. Maybe it will set us free. If I fail, if I disappear, do not mourn me. Just know that I did this because I believe in the truth. And I did this because the love I have for all of you, for this world, is too real to be just a simulation. Be heroes. No matter what world you are in. Your friend, Izuka Midoriya. He folded the note carefully and placed it in the center of his desk, weighing it down with his favorite All Might figurine, the one from the Silver Age, with the impossibly broad smile. It felt like leaving a flower on a grave. He opened his door and stepped out into the quiet hall. The air was still. It was the last time he would walk this hall as a student of UA. The thought brought a fresh, sharp pang of grief, but he pushed it down. There was no time for mourning. Breakfast in the common room was a special kind of torture. The room was bright and filled with the warm, savory smells of Sato's miso soup and Tamaki's grilled fish. Everything was a picture-perfect diorama of friendship and peace. "Morning, Deku-kun!" Uraraka greeted him, her voice full of her usual bubbly energy. "You're looking a little pale. Did you sleep okay?" Her genuine concern was a physical blow. He forced a smile that felt brittle enough to shatter. "Just a little tired. Studied too late again. A commendable effort, Midoriya-kun, but you must prioritize rest," Ida declared, chopping the air with his hand. "A hero's body and mind are their most important assets. You cannot allow them to degrade." Degrade. The word sent a shiver down his spine. Ida had no idea how right he was. Todoroki was sitting nearby, quietly sipping tea. He met Izuku's gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. In that simple gesture, Izuku saw the entire history of their friendship, from rivals at the sports festival to trusted comrades. He was about to betray that trust, to potentially erase the person who had finally learned to use his fire. The weight of it was suffocating. He choked down a few bites of rice, the flavor like ash in his mouth. He murmured his excuses, claiming he'd forgotten a textbook, and fled before their questions and concern could break his resolve. He couldn't say goodbye. He couldn't look them in the eyes and lie. He slipped out of the Alliance Heights gates without being seen. The morning air was cool and crisp. The city was waking up, a symphony of scripted events beginning their daily performance. A delivery truck with the logo of a non-existent company drove by. A group of office workers, their faces generic, walked in perfect unison toward the train station. He didn't take the train. He walked. He wanted to see it all one last time, with his eyes wide open. He was a tourist in his own life, a visitor in his hometown. He saw the park where he used to play as a child, the swings moving gently in the breeze, controlled by a subtle physics engine. He saw the underpass where he had his first encounter with the sludge villain, where All Might had saved him. The graffiti on the walls was identical to how he remembered it, a permanent texture map on the concrete. This walk was a pilgrimage through his own mythology. Every landmark was a chapter heading, every street corner a footnote. The takoyaki stand he and Uraraka had visited once still smelled delicious, a centimeter working perfectly to simulate sizzling octopus and savory batter. The bookstore where he'd bought his first hero magazines still had the same display in the window. It was all so detailed. So perfect. A flawless, golden cage. His heart ached with a profound, terrible pity. Not for himself, but for the world. For the billions of simulated souls living out their programmed lives, feeling programmed emotions, dreaming programmed dreams, never knowing the sublime, terrifying truth. Was it better for them to live in this lie? Was he a hero for trying to wake them, or a monster for trying to destroy their peaceful reality? Be a hero. No matter what world you are in. His own words from the note echoed in his mind. And a hero, a true hero, didn't run from the truth. A hero faced it, no matter the cost. Finally, he stood before it. A nondescript, 10-story office building, its architecture a relic of a pre-Quirk era. It was mundane, forgettable. But to him, it was the most important place in the world. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside. The lobby was empty, the air stale. He bypassed the elevator and headed for the stairwell. The climb was grueling. 10 flights of concrete stairs, the only sound his own ragged breathing and the thud of his red sneakers on the steps. With each floor he passed, the memories grew stronger. He could almost feel the phantom weight of his yellow backpack, filled with notebooks and shattered dreams. He remembered the desperation, the feeling of his world ending as he trudged up these same stairs after All Might had flown away, leaving him alone with the verdict: no, you cannot be a hero. The irony was a bitter pill. He had climbed these stairs then to find an ending. He was climbing them now to force one. He pushed open the heavy metal door at the top. It scraped against the concrete with a protesting groan, and then he was there. The rooftop. It was exactly as he remembered. The gravel crunched under his feet. The low parapet fence, rusted in places. The cluster of water towers and ventilation units. The afternoon sun was warm, casting his long shadow across the roof. In the distance, the city sprawled, a breathtaking vista of glass and steel. He walked to the center of the roof, to the exact spot where All Might had landed, his impact cratering the concrete. The damage was still there, a permanent scar on the landscape, a reminder of the day a god had descended and spoken to a boy. A wave of doubt, cold and sickening, washed over him. He stood there, a lone teenager on a rooftop, about to declare war on the universe based on a series of glitches and a desperate theory. What if Ida and Uraraka were right? What if he was just exhausted, stressed, breaking under the pressure? What if the impossible cloud was a rare weather phenomenon, the code a stress-induced hallucination, and All Might's hollow answer was just a man struggling to articulate a painful memory? If he was wrong, he was about to throw away everything. His friends. His dream. The incredible gift of one for all. He would be branded a traitor, a villain. He would break his mother's heart. He would disgrace the name of All Might. The faces of his friends swam in his vision. Ida's earnest loyalty. Uraraka's unwavering support. Todoroki's quiet strength. Kirishima's bright, manly spirit. Bakugo's explosive, frustrating, essential rivalry. They were his world. Was he about to murder them all on a hunch? Tears streamed down his face, hot and silent. He squeezed his eyes shut. Please, he whispered to the empty sky, please, let me be wrong. But he wasn't. The memory of the high-pitched static returned, the sound of a system straining. The image of the looping man, a puppet on a string. The sight of the librarian's empty eyes. And the code, //weather _array _04 static //. It was burned into his memory, an indelible brand of truth. He was not crazy. He was awake. He wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his sleeve. His expression hardened. The doubt receded, replaced by the cold, hard resolve he'd woken with. He had his answer. The simulation was real. Now he had to act. He turned his gaze upward, to the perfect, artificial blue of the sky. Not at a villain. Not at a falling citizen. He looked at the boundary. At the wall of his prison. I'm sorry, he whispered. It was an apology to his friends, to his mother, to All Might, the idea of him, at least. I'm sorry for what I have to do. He took a steadying breath and sank into a low stance. One for all, he murmured, the words a final, somber prayer. The familiar green lightning began to crackle around him, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't the heroic aura of a savior. It was the volatile energy of a virus entering a system. It was a declaration of intent. Full calling. 20%. The power surged through him. The gravel around his feet stirred. He could already hear it, the faint, high-pitched static at the edge of his hearing. 50%. A roar of power erupted from him. The static in his head became a sharp whine. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with ozone. A ventilation unit 50 feet away flickered, its texture momentarily degrading into a flat, gray polygon before snapping back into focus. He was already affecting the world around him just by powering up. 80%. The power was immense, a raging supernova contained within his skin. The green lightning was no longer just dancing. It was lashing out, scorching the gravel beneath his feet. The whine in his head was a piercing shriek. The pressure behind his eyes was immense, and the edges of his vision began to pixelate, breaking down into tiny squares of red, green, and blue. The world was struggling to render him. Tears of pain and exertion streamed from his eyes, but his gaze was fixed on the heavens. This wasn't for a Detroit smash or a Delaware smash. This power had no target but the system itself. 100%, the world screamed. The power of one for all, raw and untamed, detonated within him. It was the power of 8 generations of heroes, focused into a single, impossible point. But instead of channeling it into a limb, he let it flood his entire being. Green energy erupted from him in a blinding column of light, a beacon of pure rebellion. The rooftop beneath him cracked and groaned, not from physical force, but as if the very code that defined it was being corrupted. And then he jumped. He didn't leap toward a villain. He launched himself straight up, a human missile aimed at the heart of the sky. He was a defiance of gravity, a rejection of the ground, a middle finger to the entire narrative of his life. The wind shrieked past him as he ascended, faster and faster, the city shrinking below him with astonishing speed. He was 100 feet up. 200. 500. The air grew thin, but he didn't need to breathe. He was fueled by pure, simulated power. He was aiming for nothing. The empty blue, and then he hit it. It wasn't a crash. There was no sound of impact, no explosion. It was a cessation. All of his impossible, upward momentum simply vanished, absorbed by something that wasn't there. He stopped dead in the air, 1,000 feet above the city. For a moment, he hung there, suspended in the impossible blue. Then, a sound echoed, not through the air, but through the very fabric of reality. It was a deep, resonant tchrrmm, like a colossal drum skin being struck. Where his head had impacted the sky, a crack appeared. It wasn't a crack in glass or ice. It was a hairline fracture of shimmering, emerald green light, a line of raw code made visible. It spiderwebbed outward from the point of impact, branching like circuits on a motherboard. And as the cracks spread, the world below him froze. He looked down, his heart ceasing to beat. Every car on every street had stopped. A flock of pigeons over a distant park was frozen in mid-flap. A flag on a skyscraper, which had been fluttering in the wind, was now rigid, a perfect sculpture of cloth. The smoke from a chimney hung in the air, a solid, unmoving plume. The entire world, all its millions of moving parts and scripted lives, had been paused. He had pressed the pause button on reality. It was the ultimate confirmation. The most terrifying validation he could have ever imagined. His breath hitched. He was floating, weightless, before a cracked and broken sky. He had done it. He had broken the simulation. But he wasn't free yet. He was just in the system's error state. He pulled his fist back. The green energy of one for all, still at a blistering 100%, coiled around his arm. He saw the faces of his friends again, not as a source of doubt, but as his reason. He was doing this for them. To find out if their souls were as real as he believed them to be. He punched the sky. The impact was cataclysmic. The green cracks exploded outward, and a new sound, a shrill, electronic alarm, blared directly inside his mind. A line of stark, red text flashed in his vision, so large it blotted out the world. Warning, boundary breach detected. Initiating system integrity protocol. Failed. Good, he grunted, the single word a guttural cry of defiance. The sky, that perfect, flawless blue, began to shatter. It didn't fall in shards like glass. It derendered. Chunks of the cerulean facade flaked away like old paint, dissolving into flickering pixels that winked out of existence. Behind it, there was no blackness of space. There was no sun. There was the void. It was an abyss of pure information. A dizzying, nauseating, infinite expanse filled with scrolling lines of glowing code. Green, gold, and white data streams flowed in impossible rivers, intersecting and branching. He could see the building blocks of his universe, physics constants, character behavior trees, asset file names, dialogue scripts. It was the source code of creation, and it was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. The shattering accelerated. The clouds, including the distant, fractal patterned one, dissolved into text strings /proc_cloud_gen_07//. The sun wasn't a star. It was a bright point of light labeled //primary_light_source_global //. He had not just cracked the sky. He had peeled back the GUI of his universe and was staring directly into the command line. The decay was contagious. He looked down, and the world below was beginning to unravel. The rooftop he had launched from, the building itself, lost its texture and color, resolving into a wireframe grid of glowing green lines. Then, the lines themselves unraveled, and the building was gone. Then the floor of his reality began to dissolve. It started from the point of the breach, spreading like a virus. The frozen city below him vanished street by street, block by block, de-rendering into the same wireframe grid and then into nothing. The world was being deleted, and then, there was nothing beneath him. The last vestige of his physical world disappeared, and he began to fall. It was not a fall through air. There was no wind resistance, no terminal velocity. He was tumbling weightlessly through the infinite abyss of code. The sensory overload was absolute. The alarm in his head was now joined by a deafening roar, the sound of 1 trillion processes executing and failing at once. It was the sound of the entire simulation crashing, the combined noise of every conversation, every footstep, every thought his world had ever contained, all converging on him in a tidal wave of raw data. He tumbled, end over end, through rivers of light and information. He saw his own life flash before him, not as memories, but as file names scrolling past. Izuku_childhood_01.mp4, Bakugo_rivalry_arc.xml, allmight_succession_event.exe. His body started to glitch. His hand flickered, becoming translucent. For a horrifying second, he could see the code scrolling past through his own skin. He was derendering, too. The program was deleting its corrupted protagonist. The only thing that remained solid was the crackling green lightning of One for All, clinging to his form, a stubborn bit of code refusing to be erased. It was the source of the crash, and it was the last part of him to go. He felt his consciousness, his very sense of self, begin to fray at the edges. His thoughts, his memories, his name, they were all just data points being unallocated, their memory addresses being freed up. He was dissolving into the noise. His last coherent thought was not of fear, but of a strange, serene acceptance. He had pulled the thread. He had unraveled everything. He had chosen truth over comfort. Whatever came next, it would be real. He closed his eyes as the roaring data storm consumed him, and the universe of Izuku Midoriya, the boy who could be a hero, faded to white. Consciousness did not return like a light switching on. It seeped back in, a slow, viscous tide of sensation flowing into an abyss of nothingness. The first sensation was sound, a deep, rhythmic, muffled thumping. Thump thump. Thump thump. It was slow, ponderous, like a giant heart beating miles away. Or perhaps it was his own. The second sensation was touch. He was floating. Suspended in a dense, lukewarm fluid that pressed in on him from all sides, a gentle, smothering embrace. He was naked, and the liquid clung to him like a second skin, thick and viscous. It filled his mouth, his nose, his lungs. The primal, animal panic of drowning flared in his hindbrain, a silent scream for air. He tried to thrash, to cough, to expel the fluid, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. They felt like waterlogged branches, disconnected from his will. But he wasn't drowning. A strange, clinical part of his mind, the analyst that refused to die, noted that he was receiving oxygen. There was no burning in his chest, no desperate need to breathe. The fluid itself seemed to be breathing for him, a slow, mechanical exchange of gas occurring directly through the tissues of his lungs. The realization was not comforting, it was profoundly alien. The third sensation was sight, though it offered no clarity. He opened his eyes to a murky, amber-colored world, like staring through a jar of old honey. Distorted shapes and faint lights moved beyond his prison of gel, too blurry to comprehend. He felt contained, trapped, and then he felt the tethers. Thin, insistent pressures all over his body. A nest of fine wires attached to his scalp, pulling gently at his hair. A thicker tube snaking down his throat, the source of the gel filling his lungs. Another in his stomach. Ports and connections dotted his arms, his chest, the base of his spine. He was a marionette, his strings held by an unseen puppeteer. Memory crashed back into him, not as a gentle stream but as a data burst of pure chaos. The rooftop. The impossible power of one for all at 100%. The upward launch. The shattering sky. The scream of the system warning. The terrifying, beautiful abyss of pure code. The feeling of his own body, his very self, derendering, dissolving into the static. He had crashed the simulation. This was what came after. The muffled thumping sound grew louder, closer. A new sound joined it, a low, powerful hiss, like the release of a massive pneumatic seal. The amber world around him began to recede. The gel drained away with a sickening gurgle, leaving his skin slick and cold. The tube in his throat retracted with a violating pull that made him gag, and he coughed, a wet, rattling sound. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he drew a breath of real air. It was agony. The air was thin, cold, and sterile. It burned in his unused lungs, each gasp a fresh torment. His whole body convulsed with a fit of coughing, expelling the last of the nutrient-rich gel. He collapsed forward, but something held him up, the web of wires still attached to his body. His vision cleared. The world sharpened into a terrifying, high-definition reality. He was in a pod. A coffin-like vessel of gleaming chrome and thick, transparent plasteel. It was tilted upright, and he was slumped against the restraints. The front panel had retracted, opening him up to a room that was the antithesis of everything he had ever known. There was no color. No warmth. No life. The chamber was vast, circular, and shrouded in oppressive darkness. The only light came from the cold, clinical glow of countless monitors and holographic displays, casting long, dancing shadows that made the machinery seem to breathe. The floor was a polished black composite that reflected the harsh blue and green lights like a dark, still lake. The air smelled of antiseptic, ozone, and the faint, coppery scent of hot circuits. A low, constant hum pervaded everything, the sound of unimaginable technology working tirelessly in the dark. And the pods. God, the pods. His was just one of dozens, perhaps hundreds, arranged in concentric circles around the central observation platform. Each pod was a chrome and glass sarcophagus, identical to his own, and in each pod, someone was sleeping. His breath hitched. His heart, his real heart, hammered against his ribs with a frantic, terrified rhythm. He wasn't just looking at strangers. Directly across from him, in the adjacent circle of pods, a girl with a brown bob and round, peaceful cheeks floated in the same amber gel he had just escaped. Wires like silver spiderwebs were attached to her head. Achiko Uraraka. She looked serene, as if dreaming of something pleasant. Izuku's mind flashed with a memory. Her bright, determined face during the sports festival, her hand outstretched to him, her laughter echoing in the dorm common room. The sight of her like this, a specimen in a jar, broke something inside him. He frantically scanned the other pods. To her right, Tenya Ida, his expression stern even in sleep, his body held in the same state of suspended animation. Next to him, Shoto Todoroki, his two-toned hair stark against the amber fluid, his scarred face as impassive as ever. Izuku remembered the fire, the ice, the declaration of friendship, the quiet solidarity. It was all a script. His gaze swept further, a frantic, desperate inventory of his stolen friends. Tsuyu Ajui, her long green hair floating like seaweed. Eijiro Kurishima, his usually sharp and cheerful features softened in slumber. Momo Yaorozu, her brow furrowed slightly as if working through a complex problem even in her dreams. And then he saw him. Katsuki Bikugo. Even in the stasis of the pod, he looked furious. His fists were loosely clenched, his brows drawn together in a permanent scowl. Izuku felt a phantom echo of explosions, the scent of nitroglycerin, the sting of 1,000 insults, the solid, grounding reality of their rivalry that had pushed him, defined him, and made him stronger. To see him like this, helpless and unaware, was a violation so profound it made Izuku want to scream. These were not the vibrant, powerful heroes in training he knew. They were pale, thin, their muscles undefined, their bodies lacking the hard-won strength of their simulated lives. They were blank slates, lab rats in a sprawling, horrific experiment. His desperate search culminated in one final pod, larger than the others, set slightly apart. Inside, floating in the gel, was a man. He was skeletal, emaciated, his blonde hair hanging lank and lifeless. The iconic V-shaped bangs were there, but the man was a ghost, a hollowed-out echo of the symbol of peace. Tashinori Yagi. The sight didn't bring the same sharp pain as seeing his friends. It brought a cold, dead certainty. The charismatic hero, the booming laugh, the unwavering belief, it was all a mask. Not just the muscle form. The entire persona. This frail, sleeping man was just the hardware running the All Might program. Izuku's mind, unable to process the sheer scale of the horror, tried to retreat. This was a nightmare. The simulation hadn't crashed. It had just transitioned into a new, more terrifying level. This was a villain's quirk. A trap set by Shigaraki or All for One. Any explanation was better than the one screaming at him from the evidence before his eyes. He tried to activate One for All. He reached for it, for that familiar, swelling warmth, the river of power that was his very soul. He clenched his fist, expecting the surge of green lightning, the hum of borrowed strength. Nothing. He felt nothing. No spark. No warmth. Just the deep, aching weakness of atrophied muscles. He tried again, gritting his teeth, focusing with all his will, screaming smash. In the confines of his mind, the silence in his veins was his only answer. The power wasn't just gone. It had never been there. It was a line of code that had been deleted. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind from his already burning lungs. He was quirkless. He was just Deku again. The useless, powerless, dream-obsessed boy standing on a rooftop. A sob, raw and broken, tore itself from his throat. He slumped forward against the wires, a puppet with its strings cut, his strength utterly gone. It was at that moment he realized he was no longer alone. A figure had emerged from the shadows of the central observation deck. A woman. She moved with a weary, quiet grace, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished black floor. She wore a simple, sterile white lab coat over a gray jumpsuit, the fabric worn and frayed at the cuffs. Her hair was a nondescript brown, pulled back into a severe, functional bun, with strands escaping to frame a face etched with profound exhaustion. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of 1,000 sleepless nights. But it was her eyes themselves that held him captive. They were a deep, intelligent gray, and they swam with an immense, ancient sadness. This was not the face of a mad scientist cackling over her experiment. It was the face of a doctor who had lost too many patients. She stopped before his pod, her expression a mixture of clinical assessment and something else, pity. She held a small, metallic device in her hand. Subject 137, she said, her voice low and calm, yet carrying easily in the cavernous room. It was a voice that had given 1,000 reports, a voice scrubbed clean of overt emotion. Can you understand me? Izuku stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of terror and rage. Who are you? He rasped, his voice raw and unused. Where am I? What is this place? What did you do to my friends? The woman's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to the other pods, a muscle twitching in her jaw. They are stable. They are unharmed, she said, her voice remaining level. They are still in the simulation. Only you have been extracted. She raised the device. It emitted a soft blue light. I am going to disconnect your primary neural interface. This may be disorienting. Please try to remain still. Before he could protest, she moved with practiced efficiency. She reached toward his head, her fingers surprisingly gentle as they navigated the wires. One by one, she detached the connections at his temples, the base of his skull, and along his spine. Each disconnection sent a tiny, phantom jolt through his nervous system, like a static shock. The final one, a thick cable at the nape of his neck, was removed with a soft click. The last of the tethers was gone. His body, now free, immediately betrayed him. His legs, weak and unused for what felt like a lifetime, gave way. He pitched forward out of the pod, a pathetic, clumsy fall. But he didn't hit the cold, hard floor. The woman caught him. She was stronger than her weary frame suggested, her arm wrapping around his frail torso, supporting his weight. Her touch was firm, impersonal, yet not unkind. She eased him down into a sitting position on the edge of the pod's platform, his bare feet resting on the shockingly cold floor. he was tiny. He looked down at himself, and saw the body of his 14-year-old self. Scrawny, pale, utterly lacking the muscle and sinew he had spent years building. The scars on his arms were gone. He was a blank page. The hero known as Deku had been erased, leaving only Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless boy. He began to shake uncontrollably, the cold of the room seeping into his bones. The woman removed her lab coat and, in a gesture of surprising compassion, draped it over his shivering shoulders. It smelled faintly of her, of antiseptic and tired humanity. "Where am I?" he demanded again, his teeth chattering. He looked up at her, his eyes wild. "Is this a villain's base? Is this all for one's doing? Answer me." The woman knelt before him, bringing herself to his eye level. Her sad, gray eyes met his, and in their depths he saw not malice, but a weary, devastating truth. "My name is Dr. Eris Thorne," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "And this is not a villain's base. This is Sanctuary, the last bastion of human civilization." Izuku just stared, his mind refusing to connect the words. Civilization? What are you talking about? What happened to Japan? To the world? Dr. Thorne let out a long, slow sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Japan, as you knew it, has not existed for over 150 years. The statement hung in the air between them, an impossible, nonsensical declaration. Izuku shook his head in violent denial. No. No, that's a lie. I was there this morning. I had breakfast with my friends. I saw the city. You saw a memory, Izuku Midoriya, she corrected him gently. A meticulously crafted recreation. A story? Your name is Izuku Midoriya. That part is true. But you are also Subject 137. Your world, your quirk, your life. It was the optimal run of a simulation called Project Cornerstone. Each word was a nail being hammered into his coffin. Subject 137. The dehumanizing label. Optimal run. The confirmation that his entire struggle, his triumphs and failures, were just data points in an experiment. Simulation. The word that sealed his fate. He was still shaking his head, a mantra of no, no, no escaping his lips. That's impossible. One for all. All Might gave it to me. I felt it. It was real. It was the most complex piece of code we ever designed, Thorne replied, her voice tinged with a hint of academic pride that was quickly swallowed by sadness. A program that simulated the accumulation and transference of power, tied directly to your psychological and emotional state. It was designed to be the ultimate catalyst, and you, Izuku Midoriya, were the perfect subject to receive it. She looked into his eyes, and he could see she was telling him the truth. The horrifying, world-shattering, soul-destroying truth. But why? He finally whispered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a vast, empty chasm of despair. Why would you do this? Create a whole world, create us, just to lie to us? Dr. Thorne stood up and gestured toward the central observation deck. Come. It is better if I show you. She helped him to his feet. His legs were like jelly, barely able to support his own meager weight. He leaned on her heavily as she guided him up a short ramp to the main platform. It was a circle of consoles and holographic projectors, the nerve center of the entire facility. She tapped a series of commands onto a glass-like interface. One of the largest monitors, a wall-sized screen that had been displaying scrolling lines of diagnostic code, flickered and changed. The image that appeared made Izuku's breath catch in his throat. It was Yui High School. He was looking at it from a high-angle, God's eye view. The main building, the dorms, ground beta, it was all there, rendered in perfect, heartbreaking detail. But it was frozen, a moment in time, captured and held, and in the sky, high above the main campus, was a gaping wound. A black hole in the perfect blue, ringed with the shimmering green cracks he had created. It was a digital scar, a boundary breach, and floating near the epicenter of the damage, a tiny, insignificant figure suspended between the broken sky and the frozen world, was himself. A tiny sprite of a character model, caught in the instant before his fall into the code. That was 37 minutes ago, Dr. Thorne said quietly, her voice echoing in the vast, dark room. Your actions caused a full system crash, a recursive loop in the core physics engine that we couldn't contain. We had no choice but to initiate an emergency extraction on the primary user. Izuku couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. He was looking at his own tombstone. The grave of his entire universe. The proof. The undeniable, absolute proof. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dream. It was real. He had done it. He sank to his knees on the cold platform, the borrowed lab coat pooling around him. The strength that had supported him, the desperate resolve to find the truth, had carried him this far. But the truth was a weight too heavy to bear. His world was a lie. His friends were puppets. His power was a program. His life was an experiment. Welcome to the observation deck, Izuku Midoriya, Dr. Thorne said, her voice filled with a profound and terrible finality. Welcome to the year 2342. The numbers meant nothing and everything. They were just another piece of the impossible puzzle, another confirmation that everything he knew was gone. He wasn't just in another place. He was in another time. A future he couldn't comprehend, built on the ashes of a past he now knew was a fabrication. A sound started in his throat, a low, animal whimper of pure, undiluted agony. It grew into a wail, then a scream not of rage or defiance, but of absolute, soul-shattering loss. It was the sound of a boy mourning the death of his entire universe, the death of his own soul. He collapsed onto the floor, curling into a fetal position, his screams echoing unanswered in the vast, cold, dark heart of the real world.